Travel nursing agencies have been sending me messages for the past few years since I first did travel nursing during the pandemic, with offers of somewhere between 2,300 and 3,000 per week. And I think some people might hear that and think, wow, that's a lot of money. But let's break it down and see if it is a lot of money. So for context, during COVID, travel nurses were making $4,000, $5,000, or even $10,000 a week on crisis contracts. Nurses were paying off their houses, buying brand new cars, cash, and so on and so on. You can only imagine what people were doing with their money. I mean, people also enjoyed themselves. Like, I went to Las Vegas with a friend who was making $10,000 a week in the unit I was working in. And let me just say, I experienced Vegas as one should. That's a story for another day. So let's talk some numbers. Let me show you what maybe, let's say 2,600, somewhere between 2,300 and 3,000. Let's see what that looks like in real numbers in terms of, is it a lot of money or is it not a lot of money? Okay, so let's look at that for a minute. So let's say you've got an offer for 2,600 a week. It's a 13-week contract and you're working 36 hours a week. And let's assume that this is somewhere like the offer that I got for Kansas was 3,000 a week. And so I'm going to work with Kansas as the example. And out of that money, let's say if it was just 2,600, because I want to work with something in between the lowest and the highest offer that I ever got recently. That is not during the pandemic. During the pandemic, it was way more than that. So out of that $2,600, only about $900 of it is taxable. That's what they would consider your wage. The rest of it would be your stipend. So out of that $900, your taxable pay, you're essentially earning about $25 per hour, which is way less than what nurses actually earn. Even brand new nurses don't make that little. And I think even patient care technicians probably make more than that. But anyway, that's beside the point. The remaining $1,700 is the stipend. So the stipend is what you are expected to use for your housing and for your meals. And so that portion of it is not taxable. So when the agencies give you that offer and say, we are offering you a contract in Kansas for $2,600 per week, they structure it as though all of that money is your pay, but it's not your pay. It's what you're expected to live on since you're traveling away from home. Part of it is your pay, but part of it is the stipend. So just because it's tax-free doesn't mean that it's cost-free. So yes, the stipend is not taxed, but you still need to use it. It's still a cost, as in when you go to Kansas from Texas, you're still going to need to rent a place to live for those 13 weeks. And that means it's going to be a short-term let. And short-term lettings cost more than long-term lettings because it's more work for the owner to maintain that place. And also they're already furnished. So the cost of renting a place that's furnished is going to be a little bit more. And then you have to think about your transport to Kansas. You're either going to fly or drive, but essentially it's a cost. If you're flying, it means you're going to need to rent a car when you're there. So let's talk about the costs of those things. Housing, for example, will probably cost you about maybe $1,200 a week, depending on where you are. If you are in some places where housing might be cheaper, it might run as low as $500 to $600 a week. And then let's look at the cost of a rental car per week. That might be, let's say, for example, about $100 a week to rent a car while you're living wherever it is you are away from home. So Now we've spent, let's say, $1,200 a week on your housing, and then an additional $100 a week on the car that you're renting. And while you're there, you need to eat. So that's going to be another cost. It might be that you don't want to cook in this rental kitchen, or you're too tired because maybe the contract is in a unit that is severely short-staffed, because why do they need travel nurses in the first place? So maybe you're eating a lot of takeout. Okay? And then you still have your house back home that needs to be paid for. Whether you're renting your home or you have a mortgage, that still needs to be paid for. And that's coming out of that weekly total that we talked about in the beginning of 2,600, right? And then let's talk about other things that you don't have because you're working as a travel nurse. Many travel nursing companies don't offer you the employer match. They may offer you a 401k, but they may not offer you the 3 to 6%, or even in some instances 7 or 8% match on your 401k. So you're losing out on a lot of money you would have had if you were in a permanent job. Because, like I said, many permanent employers will match your 401k. If I put in $100, my employer might say, I'm going to match this percentage of what you put in. So that's money that you're essentially just being given by your employer for saving for your retirement. They probably get some kind of tax break from the government for doing that. I don't know, but that's a story for another day. And then there's the health insurance. When you have an employer, you have health insurance. When you have a full-time job, you have health insurance that in most cases you're paying part of it and your employer is paying part of it. With the travel nursing agencies, they might say to you, we will only pay for it while you have a contract. When you don't have a contract, we're not going to contribute towards it. So many travel nurses will end up getting their own health insurance on the market, which, can cost them anything up to maybe $100 a week. So you're not getting the benefit of an employer paying towards your health insurance. So that's another loss that you have from being a travel nurse. So after paying for your short-term rental and your car, which you're going to rent in the city that you've traveled to, and food, you're running a total of at least $1,400 per week. And if you subtract that from $2,600 per week, you're only left with about $1,200 of money that you can use. But let's not forget that that is also needed to pay for your mortgage or your rent back home, and any other costs you've left behind back at home. So how much money are you actually left with? You do the math. So is travel nursing dead? Maybe for people like me, I wouldn't say it's the best option, because $1,200 a week towards the rest of my life, my permanent life, is not enough for me to uproot my life, to go and sleep in somebody else's bed and be away from home every so often. And then you have to consider that if you do a 13-week contract, you're going to have time where you're not working between your contracts. And if you're not working, you're not earning. And then you have to think about the fact that if you get sick, you don't have any PTO to use for the time off that you're sick. And so your sick time is unpaid. And so the costs just keep adding up, the cost of traveling. If you're a younger person with maybe 1 or 2 years experience as a nurse, and you've got nothing tying you down wherever it is, you live as your permanent base. Maybe you live with your parents and you pay a little bit towards the household, but you want to make a little bit more money. Maybe it's worth it, going travel nursing. You would still give your parents whatever it is you give them, and then whatever you earn on your travel nursing contract, you'll probably be left with more than you would have had if you were in a permanent job as a fairly new nurse. Now, for my friends who are international nurses planning to come to the US and thinking, oh, I've heard about travel nursing and how much money you can make, I would say the first thing you need to be aware of is many travel nursing companies will have a requirement for you to have 1 to 2 years experience in the US before they give you a contract to go and do a travel nursing contract. And that's different from the agency nursing, where you come as an agency nurse from wherever you've come from and you're, assigned to a hospital for your agency, your international recruitment agency that got your green card for you, and you're staying in that hospital for however long your agreement is. So if you're coming with the intention that once you're done with your agency's contract, you want to do travel nursing, just be aware of the things that I've said and think about whether it's really worth it for you to go and do travel nursing. You can have a good life without doing travel nursing. And also, if you've just arrived here and you're trying to establish yourself, you might be thinking about the fact that you do need to have a pension or a 401k. And as a travel nurse, those benefits are not going to be the same as they are with a permanent job. However, if you feel strongly about trying travel nursing, I would say, maybe when you finish that international international contract with your agency that sponsored you for your green card, try a contract as a travel nurse and see how that works out for you before you settle down wherever you settle down. In fact, I did that. When I finished my contract, just as the pandemic was slowing down. So that gave me a chance to experience travel nursing and to experience it when it was still the gold rush. So I finished my contract in December of 2021. And I got a travel nursing contract within the same state that I was living at the time, but it was more than 3 hours from where I lived. So it qualified as a travel contract. So I had the stipend for housing and food and so on and so on. And it gave me the chance to experience what it's like to be a travel nurse. And I would say if you're planning, for example, that when you finish your contract with your agency, you want to go and live in California, you might take a travel contract in California to experience working and living in California for 13 weeks before you uproot your life and move to California permanently. So it could be a way for you to go and investigate California as an actual nurse before you uproot your life from wherever it is you started off with that agency. It'll be the same as in the UK, where when you are an agency nurse in the UK is the equivalent of a travel nurse here in the States. And there's all that compliance stuff where they'll require you to do these modules and that training and have these vaccinations and so on and so on and so on. So with each contract that you do, you'd be required to be compliant before you are able to actually start a contract. So that's something to be aware of. I hope this has been helpful. And I'm very curious about any travel nurses out there. What offers have you been getting? Let's help each other out. I have no intention to go travel nursing, but maybe someone watching this video wants to know what are fair offers. What offers are considered fair offers for a travel nurse per week in ICU, in med-surg, in OR, or whatever specialty you're in? Drop a comment below. Let people know what are the offers that you're getting so that they can gauge for themselves whether they're being lowballed or whether they're actually really lucky and getting very good offers. Thank you so much for watching. And I appreciate everybody who's clicked like and subscribe and has watched these videos. And I hope that they've been helpful to many people. And I'll see you in the next one.